Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today we're going to be talking about some of the nonfiction books that I've read in the last year. In the past, I've often found it difficult to review and especially rate nonfiction books because you don't look at them through the same lens or evaluate them through the same metrics that you would a typical fiction book. Maybe a narrative nonfiction you would look at similarly, but a lot of the nonfiction, you're just coming at it from a different perspective. A lot of times I'm coming at it from someone who is just trying to learn something new. I don't know about the subject matter, so I can't really evaluate or qualify how well the author researched it or where it stands among other nonfiction books that follow similar topics. Sometimes I can if I do know the subject matter, but a lot of times I don't. So it's just hard for me to give them a review or a rating in the same way that I do fiction books. But I still wanted to find a way to talk about them. I think it's important to read and talk about reading nonfiction more. And in 2026, we have this new trend of things like developing your own personal curriculum. Because fiction is great and you can learn a lot from it, but I do think sometimes you want to supplement it with more theory, with more real life perspectives. And so that is what inspired this video today. I decided to group some of the ones that I haven't talked about in the last year into this nonfiction reading wrap up. But instead of more of a review, I'm going to approach it more from just talking about my experience reading the book, what I personally learned from it, what I thought other people could learn from it, and why you might be interested in checking it out, and things like that. So without further ado, let's get started. We have 4 books to talk about today, and the first of which is All About Love by Bell Hooks. You have probably heard of this book. I'm pretty sure everyone online has heard of this book at some point. It is very pervasive amongst the Tumblr girlies, as well as on Twitter, and also the performative males with their matchas. It's just one of those books that you see everywhere. It's on those lists of books that you need to read in your lifetime. And so because of that, I did in fact want to read this in my lifetime. And my experience with this book ended up being a little bit interesting, a little bit different than what I was anticipating going into it. Like I said, a lot of people know this book. I've heard about this book for so many years. And so when I went into this, I thought I was going to find this life-changing, groundbreaking, that my life was going to take a different turn from the new perspective that I've gained from this book. But then I read it and I was kind of like, okay, I already knew a lot of these things. I've already heard a lot of these perspectives. And that's not really a fault to the book. It's just a testament to how influential this book has been in feminist discourse. So more about the book itself. This book is a commentary about all things love, as you could ascertain from the title, but perhaps not in the ways that you would expect it to approach love, which is what I found really interesting. I thought it was going to be primarily about romantic love, but there are 13 chapters in it, and I would say probably only 1 or 2 are actually about romantic love. The others are more about all different kinds of love: parental love, familial love, community, spiritual love, self-love, all things like that. It really takes a broad approach about how love functions in our society and also the consequences of a lack of love in society. The first thing that really stood out to me and what I personally still think about with this book is how it forces us to reframe our idea of what we consider love. She talks about how colloquially we tend to view love as a noun, as something you give or receive, as a feeling that you experience, but she argues that we should really be thinking of it more as a verb. She writes that love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love. And so the entire thesis of this book becomes more about love as what we owe to each other and to ourselves, framing it more as a social contract, a love ethic that she calls it. I know I mentioned in the beginning that I didn't find this as groundbreaking or as life-changing as I thought it was going to be going into it. And if you have been on Tumblr or on Twitter or any sort of chronically online space, you might feel the same way. But I still think it's worth to read it because it is the primary text instead of the more like maybe diluted phrases or quotes that have been kind of just like spread out through online discourse. Bell Hooks is one of the most prominent feminist writers of modern time. And so I think it's important to read the ideas from her words. And I think it's also a really great book to use as discussion. I read this for part of a book club, and at first I was a little apprehensive of using a nonfiction book for a book club. I didn't think we'd have much to talk about, but we ended up talking for a long time because when it comes to philosophy and these ideas, it really forces you to confront your own personal philosophies and how you have conducted your life thus far, because love is something that everyone, no matter who they are, encounters at some point in their life. I think my favorite chapter ended up being the one about parental love, because it talks about this idea about how discipline is often abused masked as love, or how a lot of parents don't view love to their child as being unconditional. It reminded me a lot of the dental parenting TikToks that I've seen a lot. And so I wonder if bell hooks influence what is like the modern ideas about gentle parenting. The next book I have is The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This is a nonfiction book that details the history of Palestine, but more specifically, the political motivations and manufacturing of the state of Israel. It's divided into 6 chapters based on significant turning points in the history of modern-day Palestine, starting in 1917 with the signing of the Balfour Declaration, which, if you didn't know, was basically a document that announced Britain's support for the creation of Israel, going to the Nakba, or catastrophe, in 1948, which resulted in the forced displacement of more than 2/3 of Palestine's population, and eventually catching up to modern day, up to the start of the first Trump administration. As someone who is Middle Eastern, I have known about what has been going on in Palestine generally since I was a young kid. But I had very little formal schooling on the matter. Like, we didn't cover it a lot in school, or if we did, it was definitely pretty heavily biased. And so I knew that there were a lot of gaps in my knowledge. And so that was the primary reason for me checking out this book, because it is a very comprehensive overview of what has happened in the last 100 years. And I'm very glad that I read it because it ended up being so enlightening and so informative. Again, I thought I knew a lot about the situation, but this book just highlighted more gaps in my knowledge that I didn't even know about. Aside from just the actual details of the history and specific events that were going on, I think the most important part of this book is that it highlights the fact that the history of Israel and Palestine is a colonial one. The full title of this is actually A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017. And I think that's probably the most important takeaway that you can have from this book, and what I think the main reason why people should read it if they have not already been exposed to this before. A lot of times people have tried to paint this as a narrative of 2 equal sides fighting, when the reality is that one side has been backed by multiple colonial powers that has been infringing upon their rights and have been systematically removing an indigenous population. Rashid Khalidi writes, "Indeed, there are striking parallels between the portrayals of the resistance of Native Americans to their dispossession and that of the Palestinians. Both groups are cast as backward and uncivilized, a violent, murderous, and irrational obstacle to progress and modernity. While many Americans have begun to contest the strand of their national narrative, Israeli society and its supporters still celebrate and indeed depend on its foundational version. Moreover, comparisons between Palestine and the Native American or African American experiences are fraught because the United States has yet to fully acknowledge these dark chapters of its past or to address their toxic effects in the present. There is still a long way to go to change Americans' consciousness of their nation's history, let alone that of Palestine and Israel, in which the United States has played such a supportive role." Another thing that is said a lot when it comes to Palestine is this idea of the history being too complicated or the situation being too complex to properly form an opinion on. And I kind of want to address that as well, because there is some truth to that. Don't get me wrong. Morally, the situation is not complex. As I said, this is about settler colonialism against an indigenous population. But the history itself is complicated in that there is a lot that has happened, and a lot of different players have also been involved at different points in history. Like in the beginning, a lot of the backing power behind Israel was Great Britain, until eventually shifted towards more so the United States. It also talks about the actions or perhaps inactions of neighboring Arab countries that may have contributed, and also how a lot of adjacent historical events kind of contributed and paved the way for the existence of Israel, like the Holocaust. And so, yes, history just in general may be complicated, but it's also not so complex that it is unable to be learned. And I think that's where a book like this could come in that it gives you this clear structure and timeline for you to follow. I would say this is not really a beginner text, though. I think it does require some prerequisite knowledge. It's also just pretty dense because it is trying to fit 100 years of history into an accessible format. The chapters where I was more familiar with the history, I was able to follow along very easily, but there are a lot of things that I just didn't know a lot about, namely like 80s and beyond. I am admittedly very ignorant about US foreign policy at that time, and I was listening to this on audiobook and I didn't really take the time to like stop and go back to those parts, or stop and just like do a little bit extra research to fill in the gaps that I didn't know to help me understand the material that this book was covering. And that's my fault, and I think I would have taken more from this book had I done that. While this book is dense, I also want to point out that Rashid Khalidi also injects some personal stories in this as well. Rashid Khalidi is actually the great-great-nephew of the mayor of Jerusalem when the Balfour Declaration was signed. So that was just a really interesting connection that we got to see. But overall, I think this is a really valuable resource, and it's one that I'm definitely going to reference in the future. And now going on to the next book, we have White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color by Ruby Hamad. As the title suggests, this is exploring how oftentimes throughout history, the emotions and fears of white women have often been prioritized over the material harm that has happened to women of color. Looking at that through a historical and primarily, I would say, cultural commentary lens. She talks about the history of media tropes regarding women of color, the mammy, the dragon lady, the China doll, the native princess, in particular in contrast to the damsel in distress white female character. A lot of modern feminism in recent years has tried to dismantle this idea of the damsel in distress archetype and encourage more narratives of female empowerment. That is, until the opposing force happens to be an angry woman of color, when that archetype can be weaponized against them. And of course, it's not just media tropes, but also how these tropes have permeated within our society and influenced people's actions and attitudes in real life. So I thought this was a really good introduction to the idea of intersectional feminism and the kind of blind spots that a lot of white feminists have, especially because a lot of the cultural commentary are things that happened relatively recently. I say relatively because the book is almost kind of dating itself by some of the things that it references. Like a lot of the discussions that it has are things that I saw on Twitter a few years ago, like the Aladdin casting or Doctor Who casting a female doctor. But it's a lot of things that a lot of people now will probably remember, so it's helpful to have that kind of point of reference for. I actually ended up being very surprised about how much of the discussion in this book happened to be about Middle Eastern and Muslim women in Western countries. But I probably shouldn't have been surprised because the author is Lebanese Australian, and so that is primarily the lens from which she's coming from. And I felt like that experience was very well represented because it had a lot of specificity to it, given the fact that she has a personal connection to it. But I did feel like some of the other ethnicities and racial groups that were represented were more painted in broad strokes. So just be aware of that going into it. Another thing about this book that I think affected my experience was that I thought it was going to be a little bit more rooted in research and sociology than it ended up being. I think the beginning, when it goes through more of the history, I felt like that had a lot of research in it, but then at some point it becomes definitely more of just like a cultural commentary. A lot of it is also just Ruby Hamad talking about her own anecdotal experiences as a woman of color in the workplace, which is fine, but I think I just would have managed my expectations better had I known that going into it. And it definitely made sense when I learned that this was actually inspired by an essay that Ruby Hamad wrote for The Guardian with a similar title. And so I think learning that this book was just an expansion of that essay helped me understand why the book is structured the way that it is. I think if you are not a woman of color, you will find a lot of the ideas in this book very insightful if you haven't already learned about them before. If you are a woman of color, I think you will find this book very angering in a very purposeful way, as well as cathartic in some moments. The last book I have to talk about is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. We started with All About Love and now we're on Everything is Tuberculosis, so we're hitting the hyperboles in this video. This is John Green's most recent book that he came out with last year, and this one I actually have talked about on my channel because it made it into my Best Books of 2025 video. Not surprising, I loved John Green's previous nonfiction book, and I just enjoy the way that he writes nonfiction. He writes a very narrative style of nonfiction, which I think is really accessible and really enjoyable to read from. So this book is inspired by a trip that John Green took to Sierra Leone in 2019 with an organization called Partners in Health. While visiting the local hospital, he met a young boy named Henry who had tuberculosis. And through befriending him and learning about his family and his community, John Green learned a lot more about the problem of TB, especially in developing countries, and kind of immersed himself in both the history as well as the modern day social advocacy movement around getting TB drugs to under-resourced areas. Because we've had treatments and cures for TB for a long time. And the reason why it is still such a problem in under-resourced areas is because of who is able to access the medication, as well as who is willing to invest in the infrastructure to prevent contractions of TB in the first place. This book was really well done, and it was just so interesting to learn about. TB at one point was the leading cause of death for anyone in any place in the world. And it's crazy to think about because I think most people nowadays don't really think about TB a lot. It's definitely still a problem, even in the United States, but it more so affects people, again, who are under-resourced and who are more kind of falling under the cracks of the health system. And so it's not talked about as much or considered as big of a threat. But at one point, it really was something that influenced almost every person's lives in some way. A lot of it was stuff that I have learned about, like for instance, that the idea of skinny as a beauty marker was because of the weight loss associated with TB, or the idea that TB can awaken something or allow struggling artists to access a level of creativity that others can't. But I also just learned a lot about like fun facts. Maybe fun facts is not the right terms, but just like things that you just wouldn't think related to TB that have been influenced by TB. Like I think at one point it says that the creation of the cowboy hat or cowboy boots was influenced because of someone having TB. Also, Emily Bronte, the author of Wuthering Heights, had TB. But as you were learning all this history, getting all this information and knowledge, everything is rooted to that heart of the story, which is the story of Henry, which at times can be very upsetting and sad, but also leaves you with a lot of hope by the end of the story. So those are some of the nonfiction books that I've read in the last year. Please let me know if you've read any of them, and let me know any nonfiction that you have read that you have found very insightful, that have impacted your life in any way. Again, we hear a lot about this personal curriculum, and while I don't have necessarily like a set topic or thing that I'm trying to learn about, I really just do want to keep broadening my perspectives in ways outside of fiction as well. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.